All right, we're going to pick back up where we were in the last session. And if you'll recall, we're looking at the second category of what we're calling politics and literature. In the second category, we best understand by looking at the philosophy of Aristotle. And it has to do with what makes for a good life, what makes for an individual good life, what makes for a good family life, what makes for a healthy society. Who should lead the government? How is power handled? All of these are critical questions, they're critical political questions, and it's very important, it's very useful to engage in legal and philosophical discourse about these. At the same time, it's very helpful, if not essential, to look at this from the point of view of fiction as well. Remembering again Flannery O'Connor's assertion earlier, there's some things that just can't be told very well except in a story. So, a few other examples. And you may have caught on at this point that we're asking a lot of questions, but not necessarily providing a lot of answers. And that's true. Two responses to that. One is, very often more than half the battle is recognizing what the important questions are, not necessarily coming up with the answers. But number two, in order to come up with good answers, it always has to start with recognizing what the important questions are. So that's the way that we're framing this discussion at this particular point in time. So another really important question would be, what is the nature of human society? That is to say, how is it that we interact? How can we get a broad view of what goes on among us corporately, because we're right in the middle of it, right? So there have been some very inventive ways in which authors have given us a different perspective on our life together. So, for example, again, referring to Miguel de Cervantes' collection of short stories, one of his very enchanting short stories is called El Colloquy de los Perros, the conversation of the dogs. And it occurs on this curious night in which just for one night, dogs are given the gift of human speech. And what they decide to talk about is humans, and they talk about human society. And there are some really entertaining and perceptive insights into the way that humans interact that are provided to us by this conversation of canines. And the same technique is used by Franz Kafka in one of his short stories, and this short story is called Investigations of a Dog. Now, this particular short story isn't so much a view of human society as it is dogs investigating, probing the kinds of aspirations that human beings have. So it's anthropomorphic. And the dogs ask some very fundamental questions, and one of them has to do with not only what is the best life, but what kind of life should we aspire to? What is the noblest kind of life that we can imagine? Yet another question we could ask is, that question is, how do we know what society is like? How do we get a perspective on that when we're a part of the society? This question would be, how do we know ourselves? How do we obtain self-knowledge? In some ethical and religious traditions, that's the most fundamental question we can ask. What am I like? How do other people see me? What really goes on with me that I'm not aware of? It's been a perennial question, an eternal question. And it is this sort of question that Flannery O'Connor is trying to answer in most of her short stories. That is, she is giving us, creating devices, creating situations in which her characters obtain self-knowledge. They come to know themselves as they are. Yet she demonstrates how difficult it is for people to understand themselves and how painful it might be through the grotesqueness and the violence that she uses in her stories. Another important question has to do with the law, and especially, when does the law go wrong? What do we do when we are victims of the legal system that is supposed to correct us? Probably the most important and the most celebrated novel that deals with this would be The Trial by, again, Franz Kafka, but also a short story by the Polish novelist, short story writer Joseph Conrad, entitled The Secret Sharer. It's all about doing what is right, even when what is right is against the law. So there's a way in which literature can give us this kind of insight that might be impossible to obtain by other means. One of the most important questions we can ask, of course, is what makes for a good leader? What makes for a bad leader? This is one of the principal concerns of Shakespeare. So if we want to learn about leadership, if we want to try to understand leadership, we should look at his plays Henry IV, especially Henry IV Part 1, Henry V, Richard II, Richard III, the list goes on. We're not going to find a better study in leadership than we are in those particular plays, as well as some others. And also, we should note that the novel that's being read for this particular course, La Fiesta del Chivo, is all about leadership also. In this case, it's leadership gone bad, yet it's more complex than that. In that particular novel, we don't want to go too far with this before we talk explicitly about the book, but there are important things that are achieved by the dictator of the Dominican Republic. At the same time, there's great evil that's propagated at the same time. How do we sort all that out? Another question is, what makes for a happy life? A recommendation for reading there would be by the Southern novelist Walker Percy and his award-winning book, The Moviegoer, about an individual who spends all of his time going to movies as a way of trying to achieve some kind of bliss. And what kind of question can be more important than the place of religion in society, religion in family life, religion in the individual life? And of course, the greatest work about this would be the Divine Comedy by Dante. But also we could look at one of Flannery O'Connor's novels, Wise Blood, and we could add short story to short story, novel to novel, as additional ways to explore those particular questions. And let me end then with just one other question and one other suggested reading, and that would be something I find very interesting. What is the difference between foolishness and wisdom? Are there times when wisdom looks foolish? Are there times in which doing the wise thing is perhaps so self-sacrificial, so damaging to the individual that we are looking at, that wisdom looks to be foolish? And I think the supreme work that examines this question, while it looks at a lot of other questions, is Don Quixote by Cervantes. And you have that wonderful section in which Sancho Panza is set up to be a mayor of an island, which is actually in the middle of the region of Spain, La Mancha, Castile-La Mancha, which has virtually no water unless it's bottled. But Sancho Panza is fooled into thinking he's the mayor of this island, and people, as a pretense, will bring him all sorts of questions and ask him to resolve those questions. But what is so telling is that at the end of that particular chapter of Don Quixote, it says when the game was over and when they dissolved the island, and Sancho Panza, who of course was the companion Don Quixote, when he leaves, the people did not know if he was foolish or if he was wise.